Night fell like a heavy veil, and we approached the abandoned hospital where our quietly suffering friend had once been treated. I will tell this story as it happened, plainly and without embellishment, so you can feel the steps in the empty corridors with us and hear how the echo of the past returns in our voices. We were for Olya Igor, Lena and I, and we were bound by one persistent and painful suspicion. Our friend Pavel, who had been treated here for a time, had disappeared, and the answer to what happened to him must be hidden in these walls. The night was warm, but the wind stirred ragged posters and whistled through the gaps of windows left without glass. We parked in the shadow of old trees, and I saw the building for the first time, not with the familiarity of a patient or a visitor, but as a ruin, the facade crumbling, the metal of the gates rusted, the main entrance hanging open as if someone had left and did not intend to return. Our plan was simple and at the same time foolish. Go inside, find any records about Pavel, patient codes, journals, photographs, find out what was done to him, and leave before dawn found us. We knew it was risky. Abandoned institutions are dangerous not only because of decay but because they hold traces of other people's suffering, like the pain of a scab that flares when touched. The corridors at first seemed empty, but emptiness is never simple. The smell of old bleach, stale paper and mold hung in the air. The beams of pocket flashlights played on the debris, revealing graffiti, scraps of posters about prevention, rusted catalogues and forgotten children's drawings. Lena, whom Pavel called his sunny person, walked ahead, and the scrape of her shoes sounded like small heartbeats in this dead structure. Our conversations were low. We repeated the facts we knew. Pavel had been admitted here after an incident at the dormitory, after which he began to speak of voices, of things only those not at peace with themselves seemed to see. We did not know whether these voices were symptoms, ghosts, or metaphors for loneliness. We only knew he entered the hospital and came out a different person. Then communication faded. Calls stopped, and only hints remained at home. Notes with illegible handwriting and one old photograph of him standing at the entrance of this hospital. We moved slower than seemed necessary because every step could reveal a new truth. In the first ward where patients had once lain, I noticed a notebook stuck under a dusty mattress. The handwriting on the cover was Pavel's. I pulled it out and felt an odd swell. The pages were full of short entries, dates and words like night. They whisper, "I cannot leave." These were not medical records but experiences. Pavel recorded what he heard and saw, as if trying to prove to himself that reality still existed. We found admission logs where his code was listed, date of entry, diagnosis, procedures, and a doctor's name under which he appeared as patient number. There were many staff names, but one signature stood out, the surname Pavel considered a key, Dr. Morozov. Pencil notes, printed arrows and markers suggested not merely therapy but a strict, sometimes harsh program of interventions. The deeper we went, the clearer the trail became. In the archive we found strange protocols marked with control, isolation and experiments. Some lines were crossed out, sometimes left unfinished. Our flashlights illuminated the same sheets of paper, and in the rustle it seemed as if someone read along with us. For the first time that night I thought I heard a voice not so much human as a thin bell inside a pipe. Olya found an old tape recorder in a supply cabinet, and when she pressed play, mechanical scraping turned into the whisper of a broken tape. The recording was fragmented, as if interrupted. It contained fragments of doctors' conversations, discussing corrective procedures, side effects and a name we could not make out at first. Then noise, screams and an abrupt cut. We listened multiple times, and on one fragment I distinctly heard the name Pavel pronounced not like a patient, but like the result of an experiment. The further into the archive we went, the more contradictions we found between official papers and Pavel's notebook. In his journal he wrote of a cell under control, of how nightly sessions turned into demonstrations of emptiness. Official documents described the process as a standard therapeutic program. We found letters from neighbors and relatives in which Pavel described his fears and asked for help. But the institution's responses were formal, standard and empty. As night progressed the corridors seemed to change, shadows lengthened, and ordinary objects filled with meaning. We passed the dining hall where utensils lay in disarray. As if evacuating had been rushed. On the wall a map of the hospital indicated rooms where special sessions were held. One marking a basement, Sector B, had been crossed out by hand. On the tape we had heard a phrase about cleansing below, which led us there. Lena forced a way through the rubble and uncovered an old metal door, and we descended a slippery concrete staircase. The basements were colder, water dripped somewhere far away. There were jars of chemicals, rusted cages and lone rooms with traces of experiments on the walls. Pencil diagrams, sheets with formulas and photos of patients labelled as test subjects. On one wall someone had written in chalk "Remember." Under that word hung a photograph of Pavel, and nearby someone had carefully placed a fresh flower. We realised that despite official abandonment, people still visited, and the memory of those who had been here had not died. When we returned to the day wards, the version of events took shape. Pavel had been involved in group sessions using intensive psychological methods, meant to synchronise patients' experiences. According to several documents, this was intended to reduce symptoms, but in Pavel's notes, it only intensified voices and visions. He wrote of seeing figures beyond reality, walls calling his name, and one night leaving his room because he felt he had to. Then communication stopped. We decided to search staff rooms where personal belongings were kept. Among them we found a box with Pavel's things, his old hat, a notebook, letters and a small cassette addressed to everyone who heard him. Lena played it and Pavel's voice, warped by time, filled the room. He spoke of fear and how fear could become both friend and captor. How the voice in the head becomes a companion and a prison. He said quietly that if anyone came here they should not try to understand him through documents, but through the silence that came after procedures. Where they tried to erase my name, it remained. They said they treated, but in reality they pursued a device without conscience. We searched Dr. Morozov's office and found his personal diary with notes on the concept of collective memory, and attempts to redirect patients' memories to create stable social behaviour. The diary mixed scientific rationale and emotional remarks. Sometimes results exceed expectations, but efficiency matters. This raised questions of ethics. Were they healers attending to people or researchers pursuing goals above individual human beings? Reading those pages brought in understanding of why some patients might disappear not physically, but inwardly. Further on we found a ward where experimental sessions were held at night. Scratches marked the walls and under a mattress a note read "They come at night but not as doctors." The statement made our skin prickle and we began to hear a steady sound, like the pulse of the building. The steps ceased to be our only noise as something else moved deeper in the hospital. At one point a television in the corridor turned on by itself and the screen showed static stripes, and a glimpse of an old group therapy recording. Silhouettes appeared and a caption read "Group 12 at 10 p.m. One figure on the screen reminded me of Pavel in Pasteur and a practiced smile. But the clip was only a fragment and the recording cut off abruptly like so many of our findings. The deeper we went, the clearer it became that some answers were not in official records but in human traces hidden in margins and secrets. We found videotapes from security cameras, and in one night footage saw Pavel leave his room unaccompanied. The camera captured his steps, unsteady at first then faster. He stopped at a door and looked into the dark. A person in a white coat approached and said something. The image then froze and broke into interference. Olya found an old medical chart noting that an urgent correction was performed the night Pavel disappeared, but there was no signature, as if the medical act had never been completed. This suggested a clandestine intervention that left no official trace. We began to suspect there were levels the formal documents did not show, and that Pavel might have been the subject of such undocumented procedures. Midnight shifted our emotions from determination to dread that the truth might change us. We made small discoveries, names, dates, gaps in protocols. As we pieced fragments together, a dangerous thought appeared. What if Pavel wanted to disappear? In his notes there was something like a wish to be freed from the voice of society, to move to another state where he would not be judged, which sounded dangerously close to disappearance. Then an event shifted our focus. In the chapel where patients sometimes left prayers, we found a short note addressed to Pavel asking him to return home and mentioning witnesses, and a light that is leaving, signed with a surname none of us knew. The name later appeared again in staff lists as an employee who had left under strange circumstances years earlier. This meant that a network of people remembered Pavel differently than the official documents, and that his disappearance might have had witnesses. We began searching for people who once worked here. Few remained, but some locals told of experiments in the late 90s to reshape memory. They spoke of nights when lights were switched off, and patients experienced their fears under supervision. But sometimes someone failed to return from those experiences. These accounts were unofficial, but they confirmed our suspicions. Some practices here operated outside understandable bounds. Our discovery of a locked room with metal fittings reminded us that modern medicine can assume the role of overseer. There were records about drugs that worsen perception, and methods described as switching off consciousness for hours to reboot. Pavel's chart mentioned a drug code later found in the chemical cabinet. Each new finding laid another brick in the wall of the mystery of his fate. While reviewing old forms, we found an inventory marked "Do Not Release to Family" until cousins are established and Pavel's name beside it. This meant his case had been considered problematic from the start, and the institution reserved the right to control his fate. The document changed the stakes if the facility categorized him this way. His disappearance no longer seemed accidental. Our flashlights began to flicker. In a corridor, we noticed drag marks on the floor leading to an exit, where an old bag with belongings was found but no Pavel. The bag held letters, and in one he wrote of meeting someone who promised to help him translate into another mode of being. The metaphor sounded like a key. Pavel sought a way out, not knowing he was being translated into another state. Perhaps not physically missing, but altered by treatments that erased his previous identity. In a supply room, we found a newspaper clipping about a closure of a section of the hospital after an incident where patients behaved oddly. The article was brief but suggested not only medical mistakes, but hidden methods. On the back of the paper, Pavel had written, "They do not see the end if there is a beginning." A poetic line we could not immediately decode, but which sounded like an admission that he understood and perhaps accepted his predicament. We spent hours flipping pages, listening to recordings and matching facts. It became clear Pavel could have escaped, been forcibly removed from the system, or been lost within it as a result of interventions that altered memory and perception. Amid dust and rust, a sense of a shared secret emerged, not only his secret, but the secret of what happens when a society decides whom to treat and whom to break. Toward the end of the night, we found a packet labeled "Closed Archive File Pavel," and inside a bundle of letters addressed not to family but to therapy colleagues. In those letters, Pavel asked for his voice to be preserved as testimony, not as clinical evidence, but as human testimony. He wanted his experiences to be heard and not reduced to charts and numbers. He wrote that sometimes disappearance is not the body leaving, but the dissolving of personality under procedures that do not see a person. His last letter ended with, "If you want to find me, listen to the silence and answer it." We left the hospital at dawn and the light felt oddly pure. Morning washed away the dark shadows of night but did not make answers any clearer. We had not found a single villain, nor conclusive proof of violence, nor evidence that Pavel no longer existed in this world. What we found were traces of procedures, a system capable of breaking a person, and evidence that Pavel tried to preserve his name even as his identity fractured. Under applied methods, the things we carried away were a notebook, a tape recorder, and a handful of letters. It was not a complete victory, but it was a voice. We decided to publish the recordings, give the materials to independent experts, and tell people his story. We left with a question that could not be closed that night. Did Pavel disappear physically, or was he absorbed by the system? There is no definitive answer, but his words remained, and in them a plea for attention and humanity. The conclusion of the night is not a denouement, but the beginning of a conversation. We did what we could and left the next steps to those who will listen and remember. I tell this not as an ending but as an invitation. If you come to this place, listen not only to the walls but to the silence where a voice may be hiding. This is the story of 4 friends who entered an abandoned hospital to find out what happened to their friend and found not so much an answer as a mirror of a system in which a person can be lost. I retell it so you can draw your own conclusions. When society changes the criteria of normality, someone can be left out of account. In the end, the only things we carried from that night were forgotten notebooks, recordings, and the promise not to forget. Thank you for hearing this story. Remember that sometimes questions are more important than quick answers. And sometimes the voice of a disappearing person matters more than an official certificate.